those are very useful functions of, I was going to say brain function, wow, pulmonary function, but, and that's what you'll really, in terms of hearing numbers and pulmonary function tests and such, there are more these, so it's more dynamic. It's two things together. And so here's the first one, inspiratory capacity then is how much is really being moved. And so you add tidal volume plus that inspiratory reserve volume. So the inspiratory reserve, so I'm using this same little graphic on every one of these slides. So here was the first one over there. There was tidal volume, 500 mils. Inspiratory reserve volume was above tidal volume. So if you add, it makes sense. Everything that you can inhale then is the inspiratory capacity. That makes a lot of sense. And so that number is around 300 mils. So that was, wait, is that what that's 300, it should be 3,600 mils. Is that what it says? I can't see the little. So it makes sense. You're adding inspiratory capacity. Now, there should be the opposite of that, the expiratory capacity. Oh, no, it's not. Functional reserve capacity, amount of air remaining in lungs after tidal expiration. So after tidal expiration, if you could force more out, plus your residual volume is really how much is remaining. Functional residual capacity is 2,400 mils.
Is functional and force the same thing?
Oh, you know, it is,
Well, just on your handout, it says forced reserve capacity.
it's functional. So on the actual outline, I put the word, yeah, I got my F's mixed up. You're lucky it said forced. I would admit people in the rehab and I'd say, you know what the F word is, don't you? And these old couples would be like, I'd say it's fall. Oh, thank you. I mean, none of them really laughed. Because that scares them more than the other thing they offered. I'm sure you did. Oh, good. Okay, so anyway, functional is correct. Okay, so vital capacity is then the total amount of exchangeable air, and you know you can't exchange the reserve volume, so that's excluded. So tidal volume plus inspirational and expirational reserve volume. So vital capacity there, and then you see that little white block that's excluding residual volume, that 4,800 mils. So close to, this is 150 pound, 20-year-old mouse. So, you know, we're all going to be a little bit different than that. But, you know, you're moving about 5 liters of air when you're forcing in and all the way out. Total lung capacity is the sum of everything, but, you know, you can't touch reserve capacity. But what's the total lung? And that's everything together. And so that's about 6,000 milliliters or 6 liters. So these are just the spirogram numbers. You just need to know those normal numbers, even though there's obviously a wide range of what's normal. And then here, I just put that same little graphic there so it's bigger and you can see it bigger on your screen so that you can see all of those volumes and capacities. So this is how this spirometry information is divided up. And then here is another picture that's also the same information without the volumes on it. However, it makes sense. You see that residual volume we're not really touching. Tidal volume is somewhere just the quiet breathing. And I thought that picture kind of made a little more sense too in some ways. So use the one that makes sense, and that's all that matters. I don't know how you study, but for me, I used to have to draw pictures and graphs. It was the only way I could comprehend this, make my own hand movement there with it. At a certain point in PA school, you can't recopy things. You don't have enough time. So you just find your little ways of getting there. And if it's something visual like that, go for it. So that's just another picture of the same thing. Okay, so in that tubing, from trachea to really from bronchus to the terminal bronchioles, before you get into that respiratory zone, that's all going to be dead air basically. So that's anatomic dead space. So you have a certain amount of what's ventilated, that volume you're moving, a certain bit of that is never used as a respiratory volume. So that's dead space. So that's air which enters the pulmonary space but is not used for ventilation or gas exchange because of the tubing, the ductwork. There are two ways to divide it. One is the anatomical dead space, and that's really that conducting zone. So before you get to the terminal bronchus, so the respiratory portion, the alveolus, and that little bronchus that's feeds right into that. And that there's 150 mils of tidal volume is dead space. So that's not really worded there, I think, super clearly. What amount was tidal volume? About 500 mils. 150 mils of that is in dead space, in the tooling of the system. So for respiration, you're really under tidal volume only getting about, okay, what's 500 minus 150? 350. 350 mils then of exchangeable air. And then there's physiological dead space, and that is if something happens then to that respiratory membrane, if something happens there and you can't ventilate, then that's considered dead space too. So if the entire lung is healthy, you really could use any of the alveolus. But what if something's not functioning? There is a few things. You could have some sort of, for example, an obstruction there that actually interferes physically with ventilation, like mucus. The other side of that is perfusion, or getting blood there. We haven't mentioned at all, but the fact that this airspace is tied intimately with the cardiovascular system is how why we even think it makes any sense to have lungs at all. And so if you're not getting blood there at the same time you're getting air there, then that perfusion is not matched well. So ventilation is air movement, perfusion is blood movement. If there's some problem on either side of that, then you're really basically creating dead space. That's kind of cute though, right? I hope you think so, because it just gets dirtier. Okay, so there are a few numbers that are considered the dynamics of this spirometry, and these are really useful measurements of lung function. And so when you see PFTs, and you'll see that quite often, those are pulmonary function tests, you may have had reactive airways disease or some sort of thing yourself or a family member, and you know all about these PFTs, these numbers that you get to kind of get a glimpse, a picture of pulmonary function, and also then to see how well is your treatment working. Are you changing in a positive direction or a negative direction with your treatment? So you follow these along. And pulmonary function tests, I guess they're done in pediatrics quite often because of respiratory reactive airways disease and such in children especially, but then pulmonology offices as well. But I imagine primary care or doing PFTs in their office. I just really never ran across a person that was in hospital setting. So, you got a consult for that, and you read their notes. So you just find where you want to be interested. But anyway. Here's one, minute respiratory volume is the total volume moved in 1 minute. That says a lot about the function of the lung, right? How well you move in air, not just that volume, but consistently. Are you moving air well? And it's the tidal volume times the breaths in 1 minute. And I've never said this, but our respiratory rate's around 12-ish for euthymia, or quiet breathing. So 500 mils times 12 breaths per minute of BR is not any, that's just mine. You can't put a B because that's beats per minute. So you know how that gets. So it's 600 mils, so about 6 liters is the normal amount that you would breathe in a minute. And the rate and depth would increase with activity. We need to match our ventilation and perfusion to the activity of that body. So MRV. Another, this is a big one. You'll see this a lot. So this is a good thing to know now. Forced vital capacity, FVC. If you take a deep breath and exhale rapidly, That's the forced vital capacity, how much you can move out following an inspiration. And then you can look at that over time and look at different measurements along that time of exhalation. And a really important one is what happens in the very first second. Because we get a lot out quickly, and then the expiration continues to decline. So that makes sense because of that volume pressure curve. You had to take a second to overcome compliance to get in and resistance and such to get the airway in. And then to get the airway out, as soon as that pressure increases in the thorax, air will begin to rush out very quickly, but then that pressure begins to equilibrate with the atmosphere, so the expiration will slow down. And so that first minute is really about how much are you able to get out, that pressure change. And so that's the forced vital, the first second is the volume in first. Oh, I didn't indent that, so it doesn't look as nice. And so the ratio of what comes out in the first second over the total is what's really important in following lung function. So you'll see this FEV1 over FEV ratio. And so here's a normal ratio. This ratio should be in the neighborhood of 70+%, 80%. So the greatest volume, and that makes sense. When the pressure first increases in here, the air rushes out very quickly. And so the majority is leaving early during that expiratory phase, if everything's normal. And so you have this number around 80%. So just some numbers. If you're expiring 4 liter volume, the first second 3.3 comes out, and that's about 80%.
Is the FVC the same thing as the total FEV?
Oh, no, it is FEV1 over F. Did I do? Oh, no, I put the wrong thing there. So look at this ratio on the picture. FEV1, look at this next one. There's a better picture, because it shows what's normal. Let me do this one. So, see, it should be FEV1, the ratio you're interested in, please correct that. I plugged in the wrong letters. It's my F's. I'm all messed up with my F's. FVC. So let me write that. This is a big ratio to know. And I reviewed this and never saw it any of the times I did it. So what am I trying to do to her? Now I'll say this is the one. How much are you expiring in the first second of that forced vital capacity? All right, so let's go back. Did I put it? Oh, I put it wrong on every freaking one. Ah, I hate that. Okay. FEV1 over FVC. Remember I said you'd see it a lot. Perfect. So anyway, we'll go to this one. Moving on.
So on slide 29, change it, right? FEV1 over F, it
Is that
should
the
say
number of
FEV
slides?
on slide 29?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is that slide 29?
Yeah, so we just changed
Okay,
it.
so,
And 31.
okay. Okay.
Okay, when that happens. This is why I never reread test questions. You know, you have your people that go back and reread and change. I was one, I always reread it just as badly the second time as I did the first time. And so, you know, that's so good to know about yourself, is if you're able to, you know, some people are, most people tend to not change test questions well, and when they reread them. But anyway, it's just another thing.
I'm sorry, so just to clarify, the FEV1 is the volume in the first second, and then the FEV1 over FVC is?
Okay, you're going. That's forced vital capacity. FEV1 is how much of that happened in that first second. So it's FEV1 over FVC.
And that should be 80% normal.
Yes. Okay. Oh, I wish I had done. So here is another picture. This one may or might not help you, but I put it there, that's showing this amount that you're expiring. The first second is really the majority of it. And as the pressures equilibrate from the interior to the exterior, it slows down, and that's healthy. When you have it, just don't look where mine does that ratio unless you change it. So here's a normal one. On the left, there's just several ways of looking at it. There's a pretty one. The left, this is showing a forced vital capacity, that total exhalation of 5 liters. And the first second of it was normal up there, was 4. So 4 divided by 5 is 80% in that particular example. So that's normal. A lot should come out early if lungs are compliant. Recoil is intact, elasticity is intact, volume increase and decrease is intact. But in obstructive disease, so that is this middle picture, and also up there, the flow is, it's obstructive disease. You're not moving as much air, so the volume should be decreased. I think when you look at these sort of things, use what makes sense. You already have the common sense. You didn't have to learn that. That's there. And so rely on that rather than tons of memory, don't you think? I mean, this is was one of my strategies when there was a ton of information. Try to go with what makes sense. Okay, so your volume should be reduced if there's obstructive disease. And what happens is it's harder to get the air out very quickly. And so you have a decreased forced expiratory volume in the first second. So that picture, you see the diagram, the line, the volume is flatter, and it takes a longer time to get the air out. So in that case, the whole capacity is 3 liters, so that's less than normal. And in the first second was 1.2 liters. That's pretty low. And when you make that ratio, the division is 40%. If you're following someone with obstructive airways disease, your pulmonary function tests are a really big deal, and these are the kind of numbers you're looking at. Are we improving? Are we making you better? Is this what is the efficacy of this treatment? And so these are the kind of numbers you follow. Now, in a restrictive disease, again, there's restrictive. The tissue isn't as compliant. The elasticity is different, especially compliance. The volume should be less. That makes sense. We're not perfused, we're not ventilating as well. And so here's this picture, a restrictive sort of picture, and you'll see this a whole bunch more, but here's an example. So again, less volume overall, 2.5 liters, here's what this example is showing. But you're able to get it out because the recoil is, you're forcing it out pretty quickly. It's just a different sort of dynamic. But here, an 88 or above normal for that value. So that's one of those things you could just kind of sit with. But these are the ways you measure these and follow the treatments and how you can decide. And a lot of people have mixed disease. And then your pulmonary function tests maybe aren't going to diagnosis as much as they are really the efficacy of the treatment or the prognosis as well. Here's just another set of pictures of this same thing, where in obstructive disease, the FEV1 ratio is lowered than normal, and in restrictive, it's increased. And that's also age-related as well, so there's just another set of ways of looking at it. Another number that comes from PFTs, pulmonary function tests. So that ratio is a big one. And then here's another one you may see. There was minute respiratory volume, but a better way of looking at how much you're really moving in a minute is by subtracting the dead space, basically, and looking at alveolar ventilation rate. And how much air are you really getting to the alveolus? So it's maybe a little better measure than RV, this alveolar AVR. It subtracts the dead space volume, so 12 breaths per minute. Then that should be 5,000. That should be times, not a subtraction sign there. It should be 12 breaths per minute times 350 mils. So it's the same, minute respiratory volume was the breaths per minute times the tidal volume. So that's 12 times 500, so that was 6,000. Here, an alveolar ventilation rate, we're taking the breaths per minute times tidal volume minus dead space, which is 500 minus that anatomical dead space, or 350 mils. Times 12, then is what, 4,600, 4,200? So that's how much usable air is being exchanged in a minute normally. And that's another kind of rough and dirty sort of number that can come off a pulmonary function test. And so what slide number was that, like 35 or something? 33. So when I guess that won't matter. Perfect, non-respiratory air movement. So we are moving air where you're not just normal respiration, something else is going on. But air does move under these circumstances, and it would be a miss not to mention cough. Everybody's got their thing they can't stand, but a deep respiratory productive cough is so gross to me. Vomit, vaginal discharge, diarrhea. I love pus, fine, but there is something about, I have a and they want to show you, which is, you need to see it, if there's blood in it or whatever. But somebody starts doing that. I mean, my shoulders just go. I can't take it. It's one of those things. So anyway, good luck if you don't mind sputum, but anyway, cough. I don't know, it's just one of those things. You take a forced inhalation, the glottis closes and it creates this pressure, and then the glottis opens and the air rushes out. That's a cough. And we know we have involuntary cough, and there's just, where is the irritation along the way too? And then there's just involuntary cough as well. So we have a little control over that. So that's a bit different than some of the other things. But can you get something up out of that lower respiratory tract? And cough is a great way to do that. Sneeze, upper airways. And you don't have control over that, sadly. When it's coming on and you wish you could get it going. And both of these things just spew the room with viruses. So, I cough into your shirt, whatever, but sneeze, 16,000 viruses in a sneeze. Then a hiccup, which we hate, yes. Diaphragm spasms, maybe the diaphragm is irritated, maybe the phrenic nerve is irritated, that innervates the diaphragm, whatever the cause, you have 1,000 ways that don't work that you try, and generally you sleep it off. Or is it, but those hiccups. Terrible. Laughing and crying, it's the same, sort of, in terms of respiration, emotionally induced, and there are those little, when you laugh or cry, those short inspirations. Oh, I meant the expirations. When you cry, it's inspirations. When you laugh, I guess it's expirations, right? Yeah, they are different. They are different. That explains everything. And then a yawn, I'm not really super sure what causes a yawn, but it's one of those mysterious kind of things a little bit. But, obviously we know you're tired and you're trying to wake up, and it's very contagious too, that yawn thing. But the jaw goes slack, and then it really ventilates almost all the alveoli. So it's some sort of awakening thing, and some people like to make noise when they yawn. Do the whole yawn. Anyway. All right, So so what slide number is this?
35.
There is a chunk that can go, I know what you're gonna say. There's a little chunk from slide 30, what is this, 5, did you say? 35? 36 to 48, that's a real specific little chunk, and it will involve ventilation perfusion. I feel like it needs to be now. Andy, do you have a thought? Because there's this little chunk, and I can cover it in a little bit more than 30 minutes, but it's ventilation perfusion. So like VQ, you know?
Right, for
And that
people,
should
like
be
pulmonary embolism.
super important early, I feel
Let me
like.
take a little
Let's just go,
minute.
let's just go, let's do it.
I say go for it.
Yeah, okay. That was just a thrill went across this room right now. Thank you, girl. Thank you, girl. You just stimulated their lives. No, but it has to go somewhere, but it's important, I think it might be nice to kind of put this now because you're gonna be talking about these pretty quickly. So what we want to just first out of the way, what is in air? Let's just, what is in air? Because we want to ventilate, so we need to know what we're getting out of it. And so again, atmosphere at sea level is about 760 milligrams of mercury. So you have the pressures of each of those gases there on the right, and the percentages on the left. So nitrogen is the majority of what's in the atmosphere, which is just kind of interesting. Isn't that just interesting that there aren't nitrogen users? That'd be so cheap and fabulous. Oxygen, 20%, 21% of what's in the atmosphere at a pressure of about 160. CO2, really low. Yeah. And then water, a certain amount of water is, although that's not a gas, water is dispensed in the air and goes to its viscosity. That was Dalton's law, and I didn't say that the total pressures exerted by all the gases in a system is the sum of the pressure of each gas. So this is where partial pressure comes from. So we talk a lot about the partial pressure of oxygen. So in air, the partial pressure of oxygen is 159 millimeters of mercury. And that's what Dalton's law is saying. And you add up all those, you get the total pressure. You get the total package. That's what I'm looking for. Okay, and then Henry's law is about solubility. And so this is the kind of the rub of the whole thing, is that you're in air, we're forced to breathe air, but everything in the body is suspended in fluid. And we move all the communication, not all the communication, but all the delivery of nutrients, and including oxygen, is via fluid. So now we have to cross this interface, this air-fluid interface. So surface tension is certainly a big deal there. And we have to get air over into liquid. And so how soluble then, that's how much gas can dissolve in a solution. And oxygen is not that soluble, really. So we have to have a really, really hungry carrier, and we have that in hemoglobin. So it has such a high affinity that it overcomes the lower solubility of oxygen. So the solubility of a gas in a liquid is directly proportional to the pressure of that gas above its surface, which just means, whatever the partial pressure is how soluble that's going to be. It's going to help it. So the higher the pressure of oxygen, the more it would be soluble, in a sense. We really can't change that, though. We can't change atmospheric pressure of oxygen unless we use a hyperbaric chamber. And in that case, that's what we're trying to do, is make use of Boyle's law and Henry's law to increase oxygen. It's also dependent on the temperature. We can't have a lot of variability with that either. So CO2 very soluble, oxygen a 20th of CO2, and nitrogen even less soluble. And we don't use it that way anyway. So hyperbaric chamber, you increase the pressure, that increases the partial pressure of oxygen, and therefore increases the solubility of oxygen, and it's just a way to help saturate the blood with oxygen. And you use it in example like CO2, carbon dioxide poisoning, CO poisoning, hemoglobin loves carbon monoxide, and so you try to drive more oxygen in to displace that. Gas gangrene or the anaerobic wound infections, they develop very rapidly, and you can lose limb very quickly. And so those are anaerobes, and you try to give them toxic oxygen levels and help kill them, because that works faster than an antibiotic. So that's an example of, not as widely used, but when you're in wound care, wounds. God, they have so many cool and grotesque ways of fixing skin. It's fabulous. So anyway, that's a really special hospital that carries the ability for you to plug into not every rural hospital will have that, or not every. So anyway, I'm just saying, it's not like a normal treatment for gas gangrene. Wound healing, it helps. Decompression sickness, which is in scuba sort of stuff, for example. Those are hyperbaric oxygen examples. See the composition of alveolar gas. So you get all the way down there into the alveolus, and the composition of gas has changed because of this perfusion, where you're bringing blood in, it's being pumped over, forced over from the heart, entering the pulmonary vessels in its sort of depleted state. Deoxygenated is what we always say, although there's still a lot of oxygen in deoxygenated blood. But only about 25% of oxygen is gone, but you have to load it back up, because you need it there. You need a reserve of oxygen in the blood. But that's beside the point. So the alveolar gas is different because of this diffusion of gas across this respiratory membrane and what's over there in the blood and the movement. So here was air, and air is over there on the left, and in the alveolus then, nitrogen doesn't change because it's not diffusing in, it shouldn't change. But what does change, O2 has a lower partial pressure in the alveolus, because it's diffusing into the blood. It's being kind of sucked over there because of the blood's lower oxygen pressure. So they're just traveling down their gradient downstream. CO2, look how much more CO2. Well, yeah, you had all that glucose. You have to get rid of all that carbon dioxide, and it will diffuse across very rapidly into this alveolar space. And that becomes important then, those numbers for diffusion. And we look at this gas exchange, and these same numbers, we look at them here in pulmonology, and we look at them again in cardiovascular system. And frankly, you look at them again in urology, because these are really important places for oxygen and blood and all of that stuff. Gas exchange is one difference, humidification and mixture of new and old air as well, because you did have if all the dead air didn't actually leave, some of it's coming back in. And then there was the residual air, that dead volume, residual volume that was sitting there. Diffusing capacity then is the movement or diffusion of gases across that respiratory membrane. The alveolus is a very thin wall epithelial layer, very thin. It's supported by a very thin connective tissue basement membrane to help just support that thing, really thin. The capillary is over here with its very thin endothelium, holds blood, and it has a basement membrane on external surface for attachment and shape and so forth. Where the alveolus is, the alveolar capillaries are so tightly enmeshed around that, so intimate are those two systems, that the basement membrane of the alveolus is fused with the basement membrane of the capillary, which really helps the diffusion membrane have a tighter junction, and there's less to travel across. So it's such an intimate exchange that they're enmeshed. diffusing capacity of the lung for gas is directly proportional to the surface area of the alveolar capillary membrane. And that's what I mean by this is really an enmeshed membrane. It's inversely proportional to its thickness. So if it was thick, it would reduce diffusion. So it's fused and thin, and that does not interfere with diffusion ability across that membrane, because that's the job of that membrane, so it's going to be perfect at it. And there's another one of those, diffusion capacity of the lung is that flow over pressure. Or that's the pressure of the arterial pressure is what that little A means. The diffusion capacity of the lungs is a measure of how well oxygen and carbon dioxide are transferred or diffused between lung and blood. That makes sense. And CO, so it says DLCO, it's referring to carbon dioxide. I don't know why I didn't put a 2 on that. But DLCO just meaning carbon dioxide, but there's not a 2 on it. It's the one that you can measure. So when is diffusing capacity reduced? When you're not healthy, diffusing capacity is good when you're healthy, and if it's reduced, when the membrane becomes thick, and that's connective tissue, that membrane. And so it is subject to fibrosis, through connective tissue diseases, anything that affects connective tissue. So connective tissue, have you gone through the epithelial tissues and the connective tissues and stuff, and what they're composed of? You did that anatomy. So connective tissue is interesting because there are a low number of cells and a high amount of matrix. And so you have all this connective tissue everywhere, so just form basement membranes and stuff like that, and also connections between things. And so that tissue can become less fluid, less soluble, more fibrotic or tighter. And these interstitial sort of diseases, fibrosis, restrictive diseases that affect connective tissue. And you can reduce the surface area of the membrane so you don't have as much surface area for capacity, for diffusion capacity. And those are just anything that destroys lung tissue, basically. So I put emphysema, that's the smoking part of COPD, cancer, whatever. Whatever interferes with lung tissue interferes with diffusing capacity. So we have 2 levels of respiration. There's external respiration, so that's between the blood and the lung, or the air, external air. That's external respiration. And then we have internal respiration, which is between blood and tissue. So external respiration at the alveolar capillary junction. That's based on pressure gradient, so gases move to where there's less pressure and move downhill. And so look at this picture. I love these pictures of the little alveolar sac, or that little cluster of alveoli. And then when you see this network of capillaries around them, so that you match the surface area of one to the surface area of the other. And just Google those. Just look at images of alveolus capillary. I just think it's just so lovely to think about, because I have such a cartoon picture in my head. And so when you see how great that net is across that alveolar surface, you see that ventilation is really, we are really ventilating and perfusing so that we can meet the oxygen needs of tissue. So if you look at this respiratory membrane here, the pressure of oxygen in the alveolus is around, like, say, 100, and the pressure, partial pressure of carbon dioxide is around 40. And so it's just diffusion. You see deoxygenated or low oxygen blood coming through that capillary, and at a certain point, the exchange will occur and then change the partial pressures. So when you're in the blue or the less oxygen area, you see that the PO2, partial pressure of oxygen in the venule side of that bed, capillary bed, is 40. Well, there's high oxygen in the alveolus, there's low oxygen in the blood, you get that. So what's the pressure gradient? You flow downhill, so oxygen will leave the ventilated space of the alveolus and enter the blood. And so as you see this this blood returning back to the heart. It's oxygenated, looks kind of red, and you see that there is an equilibration of those gradients. So you've sucked up all you can. Now that oxygen didn't love crossing over there, in a sense. It's not super good at diffusion, but what's super good is those hemoglobin molecules in the red blood cells just sucking up that oxygen. Now, the carbon dioxide will move very easily. So see, in the alveolus, pressure of carbon dioxide is 40, but in that venule end of the capillary bed, partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 45. That's a much more linear gradient. Yes, it's not 100 to 40, big gradient. It's 45 to 40. But CO2 is 20 times more soluble in water, so it's okay. You don't need that pressure gradient is enough to create diffusion of carbon dioxide into the blood. It's cute, right? That's pretty cute. It all works out. Okay, so surface area diffusion. For diffusion, there are 300 million alveoli. That's 1,500 square foot. Your skin is about 16, 20 square feet. I mean, you just don't think your lung capacity that way, do you? Of course, it's all swirled up inside, too. But it's equal to that of a tennis court. Okay. That's hard to imagine. Don't you like that? When your intestine, you can wrap your intestine around the earth, you know. I mean, those numbers like... actually, you can't now because y'all are so clenched. but you know those numbers. But sort of a tennis court, there's a lot of surface area. So you know you have to have a good bit of that surface area dysfunctional before you really show up with respiratory disease, right? And so that's why it's so important to catch these things early before you have much destruction of tissue. This is the big thing: ventilation, perfusion, coupling. So it's not enough just to get air in. We have all this great compliance and elasticity and muscular activity, making that rib cage big and getting all the air in you can, keeping your alveoli open. But what if blood isn't getting there at the right rate to meet the needs of the body? You know, so that's coupling ventilation, air in, to perfusion, air into the oxygen into the blood. And so those are really important to be matched. And in healthy lungs, there's a match. The air and the blood at that interface are there at the same time. And it's interesting because all other things are kind of pulsatile. Blood is getting there at a certain rate for all tissues. But with ventilation, you're breathing 12 times in a minute. And so it makes it a little bit, it's not like this is all, you're not a salamander and your respiratory surface is your skin and it's close to the tissue that it needs to get to. This is all internal and you're only getting 12 shots at that per minute. And so meeting that blood demand at that time is a particular kind of coupling that has to occur. So ideally it's matched. So we call ventilation V, which is nice, and of course you call perfusion Q for obvious reasons. But it would look like volume and pressure, I guess, if it was V and P, so it should be matched. So here's something you'll hear a lot about this VQ scan, and you forget why it's really important. So you hear about these VQ scans to look at this match between ventilation and perfusion. But the truth is your body is constantly trying to match ventilation and perfusion all the time. When it gets out of whack, then you end up in a hospital, whatever, and they order a VQ scan, which is the gold standard for looking for pulmonary embolism. But it's also a way of looking at lung function. So it's an imaging study where you inhale a labeled isotope, and then they inject a labeled isotope. So then you can look at air versus blood. That's cute, and see how well it matches up. And I mean, looking at these pictures is something for people who are trained in that, like everything else. But let's see, I can't even read what that says. Which one's normal? Well, I think the top one is I don't even remember now. The top one should be pretty normal. But here in this bottom one, you're seeing perfusion versus ventilation, and there are these big segments missing. And they have different names for what the segment is that's missing, and I don't care about that. This is just a shot of the picture, looking at that picture. So when you're not matching ventilation with perfusion, where's the problem? Is it the ventilatory system or is it the perfusion system? And this is the kind of thing that, it's just showing you a picture.
Can I ask a question, because I've actually I've never ordered one of these or even read them, but like, let's say you do have a.
You read the, you read the report.
Right, but like if I have a PE, do you have to have the deficit in both ventilation and perfusion, or is it just one or the other?
It's perfusion.
So it's
Because
perfusion.
ventilation is intact. So if there's
Okay.
something else, like if there's,
Right, yeah.
yeah, I mean, ventilation's intact, so you're not able to match the blood flow to appropriate
Because
ventilation.
it's blocking the blood flow, but the
Yeah,
lungs are
but
doing.
then what happens is the lung will respond to dead space, basically, and can constrict and kind of close it off.
Okay.
So at a
okay.
certain time, then their ventilation and perfusion are both gone. So I think it's an interesting way, that's why those reports look crazy.
Yeah,
And I'll put that up there. But certainly, we do try to keep alveoli open, but even under normal conditions, we can kind of close off areas where ventilation isn't good. And so to try to keep, then shunt blood to other areas,
mhm.
but you still end up with a mismatch.
Okay, I understand now,
Isn't that cute?
yeah.
On the previous slide, is it supposed to say blood then instead of gas or cube? Is that your blood reaching it, or is it?
You know, it does read better that way. I mean, what I'm trying to say there is you can get air into the alveolus, but if that gas doesn't cross into the blood, and it's two ways of looking at the same thing. So either way, perfusion is getting the blood there, but if the blood gets there but the gas doesn't get there, you're not perfused.
Okay.
So that actually could be written either way. So do you see what I'm saying? It's not perfusion until ischemia happens, or perfusion happens or ischemia happens, lack of perfusion. So you have to get the gas over there. So yeah, either way, blood reaching the pulmonary capillaries, receiving the blood receiving the gas is the perfusion. So, okay, look at this, and don't look at it very much because these are freaky to me. You will see more of this, but a VQ scan interpretation, so look, result, interpretation, significance. So first, normal, no perfusion deficit, so that means V is matching Q. This person has healthy lung ventilation and the blood is reaching that space. So things are matched well. There's some areas that are more hard to read and to see if something has happened. But a high probability, look at that one, multiple segmental perfusion deficits with normal ventilation. You have an 80% probability of PE. Now what's a PE? Pulmonary embolism. That's a clot that has moved and blocked something somewhere in the pulmonary vasculature. It can be a small clot, and you have a really insignificant, not even noticed issue with breathing, or it could be a large clot and have a very large segment. And it could be several, and that happens as well. So this is something, especially there's some kind of thrombus that often forms when somebody has become non-ambulatory, and especially recently non-ambulatory. Clots may form in sluggish veins and then dislodge and go into the lung vasculature. So you'll learn a lot more about that stuff. But the issue here, from my standpoint for physiology, is that we are trying to match ventilation with perfusion ordinarily. You run into it, look, the VQ scan, because something's wrong, and somebody has a difficult time breathing sort of all of a sudden. So that's not something that's chronic, but it's something that has happened recently because of some sort of blockage in that airway. So here's what's normal. Normal coupling occurs of perfusion and ventilation. When alveolar ventilation is inadequate, pulmonary vasoconstriction to those areas will occur. Why send blood to something where that tissue isn't working well? And we want to get as much blood as we can to ventilated tissue. So that's a normal VQ, we're still trying to still trying to match it together, V and Q. So the body is able to do that by controlling constriction of those bronchioles. And that happens all the time. When alveolar CO2 is high, vasodilation will help increase blood flow to an area to unload carbon dioxide. So this is one of the reasons we have control over those bronchioles, and that you've never thought about or had, you always assume your entire lung is working and all the blood is always getting there, but it's not really true. And when there's quiet breathing and you're not having to use all the alveoli. So little shifts and changes are made. Then all of a sudden you hear something and you have to get up and go. You want to open up everything and get blood opened up everywhere quickly. And so there is a constant coupling all the time of this, like you would imagine with everything else. You just probably haven't heard about it in the pulmonary issue before, to try to balance homeostasis. So constant VQ match, which is completely outside of a VQ scan because we're normally doing it well all the time and try to match that. Now, if you do have pulmonary vasoconstriction pretty chronically, then it can actually cause pulmonary hypertension. And pulmonary hypertension was one of those areas I personally had kind of a hard time getting, because that seems odd to me that you would just have hypertension in the pulmonary circuitry. And that is certainly a cardiovascular issue, but it's related to the lungs, and so you don't get to separate these things out. So if you have a chronic issue with vasoconstriction, from whatever cause, it can elevate the blood pressure in that pulmonary vasculature. And as we know, anytime blood pressure is exceeded for very long, tissue damage, end organ damage can occur. And so what happens here is it kind of backs up to the right side of the heart. That's where pulmonary problems sort of show up. And so I just want to mention these words because I remember hearing them the first time and just really wanting to block on that. But someone said something about dropping a Gans, or dropping a Swan Gans or something, and I wet my pants probably. But it's just a catheter, and it is measuring pulmonary artery pressure. So it's a pulmonary artery catheter, and that's where you would measure pulmonary pressures and how you can find out if there's pulmonary hypertension, if those pressures are high in the pulmonary artery, because the pulmonary artery is serving blood to the pulmonary system. That's all. Just measure there and see how it's going. And it's a way of looking at pressures. And that will look at the pressures in the right atrium, in the pulmonary artery, and the wedge pressure. Oh my God, like some of you'll just drop wedge pressure on you. You'll go, yeah. And then you'll go outside and you'll buy a pack of cigarettes. The wedge pressure is measured via this pulmonary artery catheter, and it's the filling pressure in the left atrium, which is receiving blood back from the lungs. That's a cute thing to measure if you're trying to measure pulmonary pressures. You look at pulmonary pressures are easiest to see at the level of the heart because it's intimately connected with the pulmonary vasculature. It's not hard, but they're kind of cool masculine names, and people go, throwing those names around. Wedge pressure, drop a Gans, give me a wedge. Okay, I'm gonna need a wedge of cheesecake. Anyway, we're just trying to measure pulmonary pressure. And pulmonary pressure really goes to this issue of how well, we've got to get oxygenated. We've got to get rid of carbon dioxide. And that's a big deal. And pressures just have to work so we don't end up with organ damage, which would be pulmonary and cardiovascular in this case. I will never forget that guy saying, drop a Swan Gans. And then there's internal respiration, which we really go to in the cardiovascular thing, that you show up in the systemic capillary see there on the right, with highly juicy oxygenated blood. And it has, there it is, but it's showing up, it depends on where you are along the way, but around 100 or just less, 95 PCO2 40. And it's just a reverse of what's happening at the alveolar capillary junction. You're dropping your oxygen off and you're picking the carbon dioxide up, because that's where is needing the oxygen and making the carbon dioxide. The lung is really just a middleman there for that whole process. So it's really about what's happening on the internal respiration side. We talk about that in cardiovascular. So glad we chose to continue and do this chunk because that ends the lecture. And this information then, I believe that's slide 48-ish,
48.
back is going to then be per your choice. Those test questions will appear on pulmonary 1. Then after that pulmonary first exam, I will come back and do in a 2-hour and a 1-hour lecture period the remaining slides, and then that stuff will be on that next test. Yes. Can you think of questions for me right now? Would you like for me to shut up? I get it, Boo. You're done.